What's up, psychedelic investors? My name's James, and you're watching The Psychedelic Investor, your number one news source for psychedelic stocks. Today, we have an absolutely fantastic episode for you, and that is because the one and only Greg Mckee, CEO of TRYP Therapeutics, is on the channel with us today. Now, if you guys like these type of CEO interviews, let me know down in the comment section, and if you guys like them, we'll do more of them. It's that simple. So now, without further ado, let's bring on the man of the hour, Mr. Greg Mckee himself. Greg, thank you so much for being on our channel today. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, thanks. Pleasure to be here, James. Really appreciate you taking a little bit of time to meet with me.
Fantastic. So I guess we'll just hop right into it then. So first question would be, what is the mission of TRYP Therapeutics?
Yeah, the mission of TRYP, frankly, is to bring psychedelic therapeutics to unique areas of high net patient need, right? Like our whole mission is to make sure that patients, specifically with chronic pain and also in the eating disorder space, get the kind of medications they need to solve those problems.
That's fantastic. I love when companies are mission driven. And how was it that you personally got involved in both TRYP, but also the wider psychedelic medicines landscape in general?
Yeah, so I've been working in the life science and the drug development industry for about 25 years. There's a deep history in my family of medicine. My father was a physician. My aunt taught nursing at UCLA, and my uncle was an anesthesiologist at UCLA. But my first exposure to the psychedelic space was frankly through some good friends of mine who are former Navy SEALs. We were working on a project together a couple years back. And of course, as you can imagine, almost every single one of them had PTSD or bouts of depression or other sort of mental issues. And, along the way, as part of our conversations, over lunch and beers from time to time, it came up that they had all essentially, used some form of psychedelic to solve their problem. And I was really impressed with how well they were all, they had all were kind of coping with those issues after their rounds of use of psychedelics. So that was my first kind of foray, and I was really intrigued to learn more. Turns out that the founder of TRYP Therapeutics, Bill Garner, is a good friend of mine. Bill and I have been acquaintances from the industry for about 20 years back. We meet almost every single year at the JP Morgan Healthcare Conference. And he told me about this new company he was putting together, TRYP Therapeutics. And he asked me to join the board. And I said, look, I'm happy to roll up my sleeves and get involved. So that's the way that I got here to TRYP.
Well, fantastic. I'm happy that you found your way to the company. And thank you for sharing that story about your friends in the military, because that's at the end of the day, the reason that this entire industry exists is to help these people that have so many unmet needs that traditional pharmaceuticals just can't really help with at the moment. So it's fantastic work that you guys are doing. So let's get into a little bit of specifics here. So you guys, TRYP Therapeutics, you have two main molecules that you're working on right now. You have TRP-8802 and TRP-8803. So what can you tell us about these molecules? What are they? How did you choose these compounds? And importantly, how do they differ from each other?
Right. Yeah. So there's, as you said, TRP-8802 and TRP-8803. 8802 is kind of our surrogate base chemistry that we're using to essentially ask one question, which is, does this chemistry work in the patient areas that we're looking at? Specifically, does it work in the indications of chronic pain and eating disorders? The chemistry itself is psilocybin. It's a standard off-the-shelf 25 milligram capsule, but it's designed to essentially answer that one question. 8803, on the other hand, is a novel variant of psilocybin. It's a novel formulation that we are working with that we'll put into phase IIb studies once we have confirmatory readouts from our phase IIa trials. But we will most likely commercialize 8803, we anticipate, because of the unique characteristics and properties that has, that solves some very fundamental issues around dose, around route of administration that we think will make for a better experience for patients and also potentially a safer experience as well.
Okay. Are you able to get into what any of these problems that they're solving are, or it's still too early to talk about that?
No, actually, yeah, we can. We can talk a little bit about the challenges, for sure. So in our experience and in the experience that we've picked up in all the conversations with academic collaborators that we've been working with over the last 18 months or so, what we've identified is the experience that patients have when they're under the influence of these chemistries, psilocybin in particular, is it's very inconsistent, for one. So sometimes, people will come in and be treated with that and have no experience at all, no trip. There's no entering the dissociative state, as it's called technically. Others will be in that dissociative state for up to 10 or 12 hours, right? So there's lots and lots of variability, and it's different every single time a patient will come in. So we want to try to tighten that up and make the experience consistent. There's also challenges, of course, where every now and then people have a bad trip, where they have a bad experience, and we want to be able to control for that as well. We think that through our specific route of administration and our unique formulation, that we'll be able to control both those things more tightly, which we think will be overall better experience, and as I said before, potentially safer.
Okay, so kind of putting it into other words, summarizing that with 8803, it might be more personalized in how people receive the dose.
It could be. There's a possibility for that. We think that there'll be a relatively standard dose curve, but so just even the basic question, for example, of traditional pharmaceutical dose ranging studies haven't really been done with these chemistries in the psychedelic space. Right now, for example, almost everybody is using the same 25 milligram dose or something kind of close to that. With our formulation, what we think we can do is although we think there'll be a standard curve for most people, so there'll be a certain dose, we believe, we're going to test that for sure though, right? We may be able to tailor that a little bit more on an individualized basis. That's sort of an extra kind of bonus, frankly, but rather it's the route of administration that we're working with and the knowledge that we know that we'll pick up on our Phase IIa exploratory trials around the dose schedule and the dose regimen that we think will be really critical for bringing a better therapy to patients.
Okay, and just one last follow-up question on this topic. You mentioned the 25 milligram dose level. For those of us that aren't super well versed in the literature, is that a super high dose, like most people enter a dissociative state, or it's a somewhat lower dose, closer to a microdose? Like where along the scale does that fall?
Yeah, so on the dosing continuum, I would say that's probably a moderate to a moderately high dose. In certain trials, for example, they're looking at 10 milligrams or 1 milligram, for example. So that would be sort of on the lower end, right? Microdosing is probably even below that. But 25 milligram would be a pretty high dose, I would say, but not necessarily high enough for certain types of individuals, right? So for example, in the eating disorders arena where we are working, we're pretty concerned about underdosing patients, right? Because as you can imagine, with an eating disorder, people are carrying a little bit, a few extra pounds, and we want to make sure that those individuals in particular are dosed at the appropriate level. So 25 milligram is probably a pretty decent dose, but we think for certain patient populations, it may need to go higher. We also think potentially that a second dose may be really helpful. And so that's something else that we're also exploring in a couple of our Phase IIa studies.
Great. Well, in general, I love how doing this type of base scientific research, like the recognition that we don't have all the answers already and we need to figure it out. So willing to put in that time and effort to do the scientific research. But you mentioned the eating disorders, and I think that's a great segue into the next topic of this interview, which is what you're going to be using these two compounds, the 8802 and 8803, to test. So
Right.
You guys have at the moment kind of two flagship programs. The first is to treat pain indications like fibromyalgia. And then the second, like you said, is for eating disorders. So let's start with fibromyalgia. Why did you decide upon this disease to treat?
Sure. So first of all, overall, we think there's a lot of different unmet needs that psychedelics could potentially address, right? So that's kind of like the interesting kind of good news, right, from a development perspective. Secondly, then, so in our work with a number of different academic collaborators, we discovered that there's very specific medical doctors, very specific psychiatrists, and other individuals in the research community that see patients on a regular basis that frankly we ran into, we had conversations with, that were describing these patients with high-end unmet need, and frankly those treating physicians in particular and treating psychiatrists were and are very frustrated with the lack of tools they have to be able to address these issues, right? So that's essentially how this came forward for us. In the eating disorders arena, we've announced a collaboration with Jennifer Miller at the University of Florida. Dr. Miller treats patients in a wide variety of eating disorder syndromes, and she's very challenged with coming up with the right kind of tools. So that was it was frankly her lead on that got us quite excited. Then of course we did some of our own work to discover the size of that marketplace and to verify that there was need, and frankly to begin to validate what types of hints of efficacy there were. But clearly in both these categories of chronic pain and in eating disorders broadly, there's a significant CNS component. So in other words, there's
What
something
is
that's going on.
CNS, just for people who might not be aware?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, there's lots of acronyms, right? So central nervous system. So there's clearly something that's a little bit off in terms of the wiring of the brain or the central nervous system, where the central nervous system is providing the wrong kind of signals back to the body. So on the one hand, in the eating disorders arena, it's providing these signals and these cravings to eat when frankly the individual biologically doesn't need to eat and is eating plenty of food. So in binge eating, for example, that's exactly what's going on. So there's a very specific brain issue, right? And in chronic pain, similarly, so fibromyalgia was a similar story where there's researchers, in fact, the researchers that worked on the approval of all 3 FDA approved drugs for that field, frankly, came to us in utter frustration that those drugs really aren't providing a good solution for patients with fibromyalgia. And on top of that, those patients in particular are large portions of them, about 28% or so, are addicted to opioids, right? Painkillers, which is, of course, we all know of that challenge here in the United States around the opioid crisis. So they were quite frustrated with not having the right kind of medications. And so we embarked on that. But chronic pain overall is a big challenge, and there's many different subcategories within that field, fibromyalgia sort of being the lead. But for the most part, these came to us because academics that we were in consultation with, came to us with these concerns with very specific patient populations with high unmet need.
Awesome. Well, you brought up a lot of great points there. I guess we'll start with the opioid issue at the moment. And when I was kind of doing my research on your company on TRYP, one of the things that I was really struck by was how you're kind of, I guess the right word would be trying to conquer the opioid crisis in a little bit of a roundabout or holistic manner, because one of the leading drivers of the opioid crisis, which again, like you said, is devastating communities across North America, is people go to their doctors with chronic pain issues they just can't get any treatments for that work, that make their lives more tolerable. And the doctors end up prescribing them these opioids. And then lo and behold, surprise of all surprises, they get addicted to these opioids. Like, who could have seen that coming? So one of the best ways to kind of counteract this opioid crisis that we really need to defeat is to make sure people aren't getting addicted to the opioids in the first place. So going to the source where people originally try opioids for the first place and trying to switch that medication out so that they're taking something that's not addictive, that's not a opioid, is really a great move to try to help combat one of these, what's really one of the greatest crises of our time. Like, it's kind of got swept under the rug recently with everything that's been going on in the world recently, but it's still there and worse than ever.
100%, right? I mean, so you're spot on in that we're treating the symptoms, not the underlying cause, right? With the prescription of opioids, and of course, as you said, surprise, surprise, people get addicted, right? So we're hopeful that psychedelics could be the answer that everybody's looking for, right? With a novel therapeutic coupled with psychotherapy, might be able to permanently, shift that thinking. Of course, and there's great examples. Fibromyalgia is one. Another area that we're looking at within the chronic pain, field is phantom limb syndromes, right? This is when, someone's had typically a traumatic injury, right? So they've had an amputation occur. There's no nerve ending, right? There's nothing that's wrong with their limb per se, but obviously something's going on in their mind that's where the mind is misfiring and sending pain signals where there actually is, there's no arm, there's no leg, there's no tissue, right? There's no nerve endings. Yet that individual is feeling this, as I've been told, this burning sensation constantly, right? And so that's a major, challenge for these patients. And so, clearly just like giving them opioids is not going to solve the problem. So we think that this is, potentially a really great alternative. And we're highly hopeful that in our Phase IIa studies that we can begin to potentially show signs of efficacy with psychedelics.
Awesome. So let's talk about these Phase IIa studies. I guess we'll start with fibromyalgia, although we can answer both of them at the same time if it works better. So when do you haven't already started the Phase IIa study, right? These are starting soon?
That's correct. So we're anticipating that this year and relatively soon, in the next couple of months, we should be in a position to announce at least 2 Phase IIa studies, possibly more. So as I mentioned, we've already announced our collaboration with the University of Florida with Dr. Miller's lab in the eating disorders arena. We will be filing an IND, an investigational new drug application, so an IND. So that filing will take place to allow us to get approval from the Food and Drug Administration to start our study. That we will announce relatively soon, and then we anticipate dosing patients in that trial sometime in the next 60 to 90 days or so. So that will be our first, we believe. There are then two others. The second, we believe, will be in fibromyalgia with a second research institute that's very well regarded. We've not announced that yet, but we will be in a position to start talking about that particular collaboration relatively soon. So we expect that will be our second IND, will be in fibromyalgia. We'll be dosing patients later this year or early next year, and that trial pending approval by the state drug enforcement agency. So we've got to, because these are Schedule I drugs, we've got to get approval not only from the FDA, but also from the DEA at a state level and a federal level. So there's a little bit of extra complexity there, which would be one of the great things if states would begin to decriminalize the use of psychedelics. That would really move research forward more rapidly.
Just jumping in there. So would the California bill to decriminalize psychedelics, would that help companies like TRYP at all? Or the way I was looking at it was basically like it was people wouldn't get arrested for doing it anymore, or having psilocybin or sharing it, but would it help companies out too?
That's something that we're looking into. We anticipate that it potentially could, right, from that very perspective, that R&D perspective, right, so development perspective. Right now, yeah, so we believe that's the case. We think that assuming that bill that passed the Senate here in California, assuming that passes the House and becomes a bill, becomes law, we think that potentially could speed up research, in that we may then not need to get California state approval to run these trials, which would definitely be helpful, because that can take up to 6 months, right? So the third clinical study that we're looking at with a third academic institution, that institution is based here in Southern California, they applied for DEA approval almost 6 months ago, and they're still waiting to get that approval. And that's just the first step before they've got to go to the federal level to get the DEA feds to approve use of this Schedule I drug in that particular indication. But yeah, that's,
if only we could speed up this process somehow, but that's another topic for another day.
For sure. I definitely want to have that conversation with you. I think there's a lot that needs to be done in the drug development world to increase the pace of trials and getting these therapies to market, for sure.
Sure. So just to recap a little bit what you said there. So you're going to have 2 and maybe 3 Phase IIa clinical trials, at least announced, if not started dosing by the end of the year. And 1 or 2 of those may happen very soon. So first of all, I guess, congratulations. That's a huge milestone to get to for a psychedelic medicines company. That's going to put you in a small group, an elite group of companies that have actually made it towards the Phase IIa trials. So again, congratulations for that.
Yeah, we're really excited about it, and frankly, mostly excited for the patients and the practitioners, because that just gets us one step closer to helping them, which is, like we said at the beginning, that's our mission, is to help patients with these unmet needs.
Okay, awesome. So zooming out a little bit, and I know this will be very rough estimations, what do you think about timelines for when we can actually see patients go to their doctors and doctors prescribe them a drug like 8803 or whatever it's called in the future? We talk 5 years, 10 years?
Right. Right. So yeah, great body of thought around that, right? To try to figure out the time frames. We're optimistic that, in traditional drug development, these compounds can take, as you said, 5 to 10 years easily to sort of get to market. The good news about psychedelics, generally, and psilocybin in particular, is that there's already a great body of evidence of safety and efficacy, right? So these are a lot of confirmatory types of studies that we're running right now. So we anticipate, well, first of all, we know we get to jump right into sort of the middle of Phase II studies with these chemistries, which is fantastic. So we get straight to the efficacy portion of those trials, and then that shortens the timeline for sure. So that's one thing. I think that the other thing is that because there's such high unmet need and there's not a lot of alternatives, that also, I think, will engage the FDA at a different kind of level. So we're hopeful that very large Phase IIb studies may be sufficient for approval. We don't know for sure, right? And we obviously need to check, have conversations with the Food and Drug Administration to confirm, their thoughts at that particular, time when we get there. But I'm hopeful that the time frame is closer to 5 years overall as compared to 10 on a new chemical entity, right? So because of the history and because of the high need in these particular areas.
So that would be going through either like a breakthrough status type deal or maybe an orphan drug type deal going on. That would be the best case scenario.
Sure. So I think there's two things. So it could be breakthrough, could be orphan. There's a couple of orphan indications in the eating disorders arena, for example, that we've been looking at. We've also been investigating the possibility of an orphan status for certain sub-portions of the chronic pain market. So yes, it could be that for sure. We also think that because of the vast history of these chemistries, right, the enormous number of individuals that have used psychedelics, the safety profile around those, and frankly, there's studies that have been done at major institutions like NYU and Yale and Johns Hopkins and so forth, that body of evidence will be a very positive factor in helping the FDA get to a positive decision a little bit more rapidly. But both those things coupled together, I think, likely shorten the time frame to be closer to more kind of a 5-year time frame as compared to more traditional, maybe 10 plus year time frame to get a drug approved from scratch.
That'd be fantastic. I hope that you're right there, because there's just so much, like you said, high unmet need in so many different areas of our healthcare system, and any arrow that we can add to our quiver to help battle all these different crises that we have simultaneously would be absolutely fantastic.
Absolutely. Yeah, no doubt. No doubt.
So next question for you guys. What is it that you see as TRYP Therapeutics' competitive advantage over some of the other psychedelic medicines companies in the field?
Yeah, the first thing I'd say is that this is such a big field, and it's so early that we honestly wish the best to every single company that's out there. We think that the more success there is for one company, the better it is for everybody. So I'll just start with that to begin with. But second of all, there are a couple of very specific things that we're doing that we think are unique compared to other companies in the space. First and foremost, as we've sort of been talking here, is that we're going after some therapeutic areas that most other companies are not, right? We believe that there's significant need in the chronic pain and eating disorders arena, and very few companies are looking at those areas other than maybe bulimia or anorexia, right? Most companies are very focused on depression and PTSD. So the therapeutic areas that we're looking at, those markets are quite unique. Now, some people, ask, was there sufficient market there and all that? And we definitively think the answer is yes. These markets are massive in chronic pain and eating disorders broadly. And even in, an indication like phantom limb syndrome, for example, there's 40 million people worldwide that are afflicted with that syndrome. So there are many patients in these categories. The second thing, technically and scientifically, as I said, we're very focused on innovating around the dose schedule, around the route of administration, and around our novel formulation that we think solves some very specific issues, specifically around efficacy and also the safety profile of these chemistries. So that specific formulation, that body of work that we're doing with our research team, as well as our manufacturing partners of AMRI and Alchemy, make this a very unique formulation with very specific properties that we think ultimately will just serve patients better in the clinic and in treatment paradigm. So there's many things that we're doing on that level that will make the chemistry that we're working with quite unique compared to our competitors in the field.
Okay, and some of those issues that you're trying to solve, they're what we were talking about earlier with the different people reacting differently to certain dose levels, that type of thing?
That's right. Yes, that's absolutely right. So we for one want to have a much more, create a much more consistent experience for patients in the dissociative state. We want interpatient variability to be diminished a bit. We want a better safety profile. We would like to have a mechanism to shut down the experience if need be, if people are having a bad experience, among other things, right, around that area. So we think there's a lot that we can do that will directly impact patients in a positive way, both in terms of the impact, the efficacy as well as safety. The other thing that we're looking at, actually two other things, is we're looking at a couple of different biomarkers. So ways that we can actually identify what's going on with the brain and the activity of the brain while patients are under the influence of this chemistry, and we think that could be a surrogate marker to let us know how well the drug is actually treating the patient, for one. Two, that we think that mechanistically that will give us a much better idea and potentially tease out the effects, the effect of these chemistries to impact neuroplasticity versus the psychedelic effect, right? As another body of work. So these things we think are all going to be unique attributes that we sort of discover about the chemistry. Lastly, then, we also, based on work by Robin Carhart-Harris, one of our scientific advisors, and someone that we speak to on a regular basis, Robin's theory is there's multiple different layers or levels that patients get into in the dissociative stage. He refers to them as different doors that they kind of walk through. And we think that there's a lot of work to be done to identify the depth of the experience and how many doors patients get through, and then what is the impact that has on a patient and their specific condition. So we think that's also another body of work that we'll learn more about, specifically because of our ability to control the dosing so precisely with our formulation.
Well, I'm super happy that you brought up Robin Carhart-Harris, because he's one of the, if not the leading researcher in the field, at least one of the top 10 over at the Imperial College of London. And so it's great that you have him on your team. Yeah, he's been very informative for myself personally. Even just his Twitter feed, he'll often tweet out a bunch of studies, even if he had nothing to do with them, just kind of informing the public on what's happening. So I absolutely love the man. I've never met him, of course, but I follow his Twitter. I read everything that he posts. So it's great that you have somebody of his caliber, a phone call away, that you can always ask and get his insight on these type of issues.
Yeah, we're incredibly fortunate to have Robin in our camp, so to speak, and really excited, frankly, that he's now moved from Imperial College over to UC San Francisco as of yesterday. Yeah, he started on July 1st, so very excited about that. He's moving his family over to the West Coast in a month or so, as well. So we're pretty excited. Imperial College is in great hands. They've got Robin, of course, has got other colleagues there that will be taking those studies forward, but we're excited that he's going to be there now at UCSF with Josh Woolley and a handful of other great researchers there at the University of California, San Francisco.
Awesome. Well, there you have it, guys. A little bit of breaking news for you. Didn't even know that was coming, but that is fantastic. So I guess my last question, or kind of last umbrella of questions, is in regards to the pharmaceutical industry, or the traditional pharmaceutical industry. So my first kind of big question is, what do you expect your relationship long-term to be with the traditional pharmaceutical industry? So we're talking like the Johnson & Johnsons, the Pfizers, et cetera. Do you hope to go it on your own and make it to the finish line, sell your own medicines? Do you hope to eventually be bought out by a big player, or maybe license your products to them and then they'll sell them and you get a chunk of that profit, or some other option that I haven't mentioned?
Right. Right. So it's going to be a really interesting journey to walk down, and I'm not sure exactly how that's going to end, but we certainly will find out. Right. My personal bias, having spent time at Genzyme Corporation, where we didn't out-license that product, but we sold that literally in hundreds of markets directly, is that we do the same thing here at TRYP. I think that it's quite possible for us to push this chemistry all the way through FDA approval and commercialize it potentially on our own with a highly focused sales force. That would be my ambition. And because there's so much value in actually doing this directly, there's so much value in getting face-to-face with physicians and also with patients. And you really begin to see the value of your work at that point, right? So that would be my first choice, but you never know, right? We obviously, we know that big pharma and large biotech companies are interested in this space. Last month, the Biotechnology Industry Organization, or BIO, had their annual conference. It was, of course, virtual, as you can imagine, and they have a whole session of one-on-one partnering opportunities that they host. And through that mechanism, we had an opportunity to meet with a number of both big biotech and big pharma companies to kind of get a sense. And I can tell you, they're definitely interested. As you mentioned, J&J in particular, already has ketamine, approved, and they're marketing that. I think there's going to be other companies that come into the fold as they begin to see, the evidence, through these large phase 2 studies to demonstrate efficacy. If that's the way this rolls out, then I think for sure we're going to see big pharma and big biotech companies begin to move into the field. And that may be something that we also do at TRYP, is partner with these companies, we may do that, outright. We may sell the compound to them. We may get acquired by them. We may just license our chemistry for certain territories, for example, on certain markets that we don't necessarily think we can reach like Latin America, maybe, for example, or maybe parts of Asia is another example. Or we may actually divide the licensing based on therapeutic indication. So maybe we'll take some of the niche, smaller markets where we can address with a small sales force on our own, while we kind of launch the product through a partnership in other therapeutic indications that would require a larger sales force. We'll see. I mean, there's lots of possibilities, but I'd say those are the kind of the primary, kind of three pathways that are pretty traditional. As I said, I've got a strong bias to do this, on our own. We'll see how it all turns out in the end.
Well, that is very exciting, although I am just going to back up a second there, because I think that you said something very interesting there that maybe not all of my listeners would have thought about too much or have an idea about. So you said you were at one of these conferences where there's lots of big pharmaceuticals insiders, and they are excited about the potential for psychedelic medicines. Maybe they're waiting a little bit longer to see the Phase IIa and IIb trials coming out, but the big wigs in these companies like Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, et cetera, they are aware of this space and they are watching it closely.
But that's my interpretation based on what I'm sort of seeing and hearing and the types of meetings we were able to garner, given how early we are and given how we know pharma typically works, which is they often wait until there's a significant, Phase IIb study with hundreds of patients in a well-controlled setting before they kind of move. They're beginning to put some feelers out there already, even at this stage in the development of the industry. So that tells me that, one, they're interested, which is, I mean, they certainly, if they're working in the pain field or in eating disorders or in depression, they know of the unmet need, right? And many of them have franchises already. They have chemistries and compounds for those areas, so they know of the unmet need. I think that what those meetings signaled to me was that they see and appreciate the potential of psychedelic chemistry broadly, as a solution to these patients' needs. So that was my kind of read on that conference. I was really impressed with the numbers of meetings we were able to get, and frankly the quality and types of companies that we were able to get in front of.
Well, fantastic. Well, I think we're nearing the end of this conversation here. I just want to say, Greg, that of all the interviews I've done so far, I think this one has been the most informative and productive. I really enjoyed talking to you, and I think I personally learned a lot talking to you, and I hope my viewers will get that value out of this also. Before we sign off for the day, is there anything else that you wanted to mention?
I just would thank you, James, for the opportunity to have a conversation here, and we'll always welcome the opportunity to come back if there's other questions that you have or people that watch your channel have. Very excited about this field and what this could mean for patients and frankly for the industry. At a later time, we'll have a conversation about how we're going to disrupt drug development overall and bring all these medications to market a lot faster, but we'll save that for another day. But thanks
Perfect.
again for
a little bit of a teaser for them.
Yes, exactly. But thanks for having me on your show today.
Well, thank you so much, Greg. We'll talk again soon.
All right, cheers.